The autumn ball at Ravensbourne Hall had not yet begun when Eleanor Bryce understood that everything she had built for herself in the last 18 months was about to end. She was arranging Mrs. Dorothea Price's shawl near the Eastern Gallery when she saw him, and she did not see him directly, because she had learned in 18 months to take in a room the way a deer takes in open ground, always from the edges first. She saw the particular quality of stillness that spread through a gathered crowd when a man of his rank entered it. She saw candlelight catch the silver thread of his waistcoat and the angle of a jaw she would have known anywhere. She saw, when he turned briefly toward the room, the stone gray of his eyes, and her fingers went still on Mrs. Price's shawl, and her breath went somewhere she could not immediately locate. Charles Ashford, Duke of Ravensbourne, the one person in England she had not permitted herself to think about. "Ellen, dear," said Mrs. Price, not looking up from the evening's program. "You've stopped," Eleanor began again, smoothing the shawl's edge with hands that did not tremble, because she had learned to make them do what she required. She was Miss Ellen Ward here. She had been Miss Ellen Ward for 18 months, a companion to Mrs. Price, who had arrived by a quiet recommendation from a quiet quarter, who asked very little and read well, and kept her face turned toward walls when the question of recognition arose. Ellen Ward was plain and useful and forgettable, and she had worked precisely to be those things, because the alternative was not something she allowed herself to consider. Across the room, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensbourne stood with Lady Harriet Pemberton at her side, her diamonds returning every candle in the chandelier above them as small, cold points of light. Lady Constance was not yet looking toward Mrs. Price's corner. Near the door, a woman in rose silk, Mrs. Langton of the North County seat, touched her companion's arm and tilted her head toward Eleanor's end of the gallery with the particular efficiency of a person who has decided something about someone they have never spoken to. "That Ward woman," she said, at a pitch calibrated to carry. "Mrs. Price does bring her everywhere, doesn't she? One wonders where she comes from, exactly." Her companion murmured something. Mrs. Langton smiled with the pleasant indifference of someone for whom such questions require no effort. "No, not anywhere, really." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap and looked at nothing. She had been told she was from nowhere often enough by now that it should not have had weight. She was practiced at the surface of things. She smoothed her expression as she had smoothed the shawl, with the same firm patience, and returned her attention to Mrs. Price. At the far end of the gallery, the Duke had not moved toward the Dowager, toward Lady Harriet, or toward any of the county families grouped in their expected patterns. He was looking at the eastern wall with the careful, arrested quality of a man who has seen something he was not expecting and who is not yet ready to know what to do about it. His hand was at the interior of his coat, one brief touch, and then still. Eleanor did not look at him again. She told herself she would find some errand by morning, or some other room to be useful in, or some arrangement by which she remained entirely outside the orbit of the Duke of Ravensbourne. She had been telling herself things for 18 months. She was very good at it. If that quality is familiar to you, you are already inside this story. We will keep going. The River Avon had been high in March of the previous year, the banks swollen past their ordinary reach, and Eleanor Bryce had been walking its north bank alone in the early afternoon, because there had been nowhere else to be. Her father, Mr. Henry Bryce, had died in January. He had been a gentleman of modest property and considerable optimism about money, the combination that most reliably produces debt. And when he was gone, the shape of what he had left behind was both more and less than Eleanor had understood. Less money. More obligation. And arriving from the south in February with a solicitor of his own, her stepbrother Thomas, her father's son by a first marriage. He was a man of moderate intelligence and immoderate certainty about his rights, who had been waiting, Eleanor now understood, for exactly this sequence of events. The entail, Thomas's solicitor had explained with the patience of someone who has explained a thing he expects to explain only once, ran through the male line. The estate, small as it was, would pass to the nearest male heir. Eleanor's portion, which her father had intended to protect, was in a legal condition Thomas described as complicated and his solicitor described as settled. She had been walking the north bank of the Avon on an afternoon in late March, turning the word settled over in her mind and considering what it cost a person to hear it, when the ground gave way beneath her left foot. She remembered the cold, not the surface cold of air in March, which was real enough, but the deep systemic cold of water filling every available space at once, the river's sound entirely different from within it. A low roar that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with physics. She reached for a root, a branch, anything on the bank, and found nothing. She remembered the light diminishing, and then she remembered nothing else until the fourth day, when she woke in a fisherman's cottage 2 miles downstream to a gray-haired woman with a Wiltshire accent, thick as good wool, who was asking, with enormous gentleness, who ought to be notified. Eleanor had lain still for a long time and considered this. If she returned, Thomas's claim would have to be contested. She would be alive, which had legal value, but she would also be a woman with no money, no safe household to return to, and a stepbrother who had already moved into the house and would not thank her for surviving. She had come to understand, in the weeks since her father died, that Thomas was not a man who accepted inconvenience a second time. She told the gray-haired woman she had no one nearby. She was very sorry to have been such trouble. She moved north over the following weeks, by slow stages, and she became Miss Ellen Ward through a careful arrangement with a woman in Warwickshire who had known Eleanor's mother, and who helped her compose a letter of reference that was technically true on every point that could be verified. She did not complain, or draw attention, or permit herself anything that would require defending. She had permitted herself one thing. In the back cover of her commonplace book, which had been in her coat pocket the day the river took her and had washed up on the bank a 1/4 mile downstream, its pages only slightly damaged, she kept a pressed violet from the last posy her father had ever brought home. He had distributed the flowers to his household on an ordinary Tuesday in autumn, the kind of small domestic generosity that a man performs without knowing it is the last time he will have the occasion, and Eleanor had pressed her violet flat between the cover and the end paper. And there it had stayed, slightly water-stained at the margins, its color somehow held. She had not permitted herself to think about why she kept it. She had permitted herself to keep it, and that had been enough. On the second morning of the Ravensbourne gathering, Eleanor rose before the household and went to the kitchen garden because the light came there first in October. Mrs. Price's elderly companion, Miss Rudd, had been deaf since a fever took her hearing in girlhood, and Eleanor had formed the habit of reading aloud to her in the mornings anyway, because Miss Rudd read lips with the quiet facility of someone who has learned to pay attention to the whole shape of a person rather than only the sound, and the ritual had come to mean something to both of them that neither had named. Eleanor had brought a volume of natural history. Miss Rudd was particularly fond of birds. The kitchen garden was sheltered by a low stone wall and caught the first thin warmth of the October sun along its south-facing bench. The air smelled of cold earth and the woody stems of lavender cut back for winter, and the dew had not yet cleared from the low box hedging along the path. Eleanor settled beside Miss Rudd and opened to the chapter on redwings and began to read, her face turned so that Miss Rudd could follow the shape of the words as they formed, her voice even and unhurried and without any vanity about being understood. She read the Redwings. She read the Fieldfares. She slowed at the passages with longer Latin names and shaped each syllable with particular care. Miss Rudd's face settled into the particular pleasure of a woman who has been given something with no strings attached, and Eleanor read on into the cold morning as though there were nowhere else on earth she was required to be. Eleanor did not hear the step at the gate. The Duke had come down early. He turned the corner of the gravel path intending to walk the formal garden before the household stirred, and he found this instead. A young woman in a plain gray dress reading about Fieldfares to a deaf companion in a kitchen garden at 7 in the morning, in October, with the patient and entirely unself-conscious care of someone who has decided that being understood matters more than being heard. Her hands were slightly reddened by the cold. She had not worn gloves. She had not, he thought, brought gloves because she had not thought of herself this morning, only of the woman beside her. He stood at the gate for just over a minute. He held the thing in himself that had been certain since he arrived in Derbyshire, and he watched her until she turned the page, and then he retreated, before she looked up, silent on the gravel. She did not see him. She would not know until much later that he had been there. That evening at supper, Eleanor was placed 6 seats from the Duke, which was far enough to feel safe and close enough to be aware. He spoke to the guests beside him in the short declarative sentences of a man who finds conversation useful rather than enjoyable. His face gave nothing away in either direction. A draught from an open window behind Eleanor moved across her neck and bare shoulders. She had left her shawl somewhere and could not locate it without drawing attention to herself, and she was not going to draw attention to herself. And so she remained still. Come away from the window. The Duke's voice was level, matter-of-fact, addressed at the air 6 chairs down from him, with the precision of a man who has been tracking the position of every person in a room since he entered it. The cold will settle. Mrs. Price glanced at Eleanor. Eleanor moved her chair 4 inches to the left. The draught ceased. The Duke continued his conversation with the guest beside him, as though nothing had occurred. She filed this in the space where she kept things she did not know what to do with, which was a considerable space, and returned her attention to her plate. After supper, in the drawing room, the Dowager found an opportunity to stand with Lady Harriet near the pianoforte and to look once, carefully, across the room toward Mrs. Price's corner. The look was brief and calibrated, the kind a general sends across a field to establish where the opposing line has extended. Eleanor did not see it directly. She saw its effect in the slight shift of Lady Harriet's posture and in the quality of Lady Constance's attention when she turned back to the room. The shooting party had been driven indoors by the 3rd afternoon's rain. The library of Ravensbourne Hall occupied most of the East Wing's ground floor and ran to natural history and classical history in roughly equal measure, with a long west wall given over to maps of counties the Ashford line had held interests in at one point or another. Eleanor had been returning a borrowed volume to the east shelf when the door opened and the Duke entered. He registered her presence by a small pause at the threshold. He did not leave. He crossed to the table near the east window and took up a volume without looking at the spine. He remained standing, as though he intended only a moment's reading. "Where are you from, Miss Ward?" he asked, in the quiet tone he used for most things, addressed at a point somewhere between her and the middle distance. "Warwickshire, Your Grace." The answer she always gave, close enough to the truth to pass. He turned a page he had not been reading. "You hold a book," he said, "as though it cost you something to own it." Her hands on the spine she was replacing went still. She was aware of herself from outside her own skin in the way she rarely permitted. The worn edge of her cuff, the slight roughness of her fingertips on leather, the careful economy of every motion she had trained into her hands Over 18 months of handling things that were not hers. She released the book. She turned. "I am accustomed to borrowing, Your Grace," she said. "Most things." He looked at her then, fully and without the social pretense of looking elsewhere. Not the idle interest of a man who has noticed a woman, and not the assessor's look of a man measuring worth against a known scale. Something quieter than either of these. Something that had the shape of recognition and the held posture of a man who has been wrong before and is not going to let himself be wrong again. "Sit down," he said. "You have been standing since before supper last evening." She sat because her feet ached and because there was no graceful refusal of a direct command in a man's own house, and because she could hear the instruction 2 ways simultaneously, and was not certain which was true. He returned to his volume. She opened the next book on her list without reading it. The fire said what fires say to themselves in long, quiet afternoons. The rain continued its argument with the east windows. After a quarter hour, he wrote 2 letters at the desk. He sealed the first and left it with the others. He held the second for a moment, unmoving, and then folded it and placed it inside his coat. She did not see this, because she was looking at her book. She heard him cross the room. She heard the door. She waited 1 full minute, then pressed her thumb hard against the edge of the binding she was holding. Because it was that, or something else. And she had no room for anything else. He had carried a pressed violet in the interior pocket of his coat for 18 months. No one in his household knew. He had not explained it, because it was not the kind of thing he explained. His sister Clara had been 11 years old when she drowned in the Thames on a Tuesday in late summer. And Charles Ashford had been 14. And he had been sitting on the upper bank 100 yards upstream because the afternoon was fine, and his book was engaging. And Clara had been told the week before that she was old enough now to walk the bank without being supervised. He heard her voice once, a single call that he could not determine, afterward, had been frightened, or only loud. He set the book down and ran. He ran as hard as he had ever run in his life, and arrived at the bend in the bank where she had been, and found nothing. Only the river continuing, with no particular interest in what it had taken. He had understood, intellectually, in the weeks that followed, that running harder would not have produced a different result. His understanding had never quite extended to believing it. He had built, in the years after, the habits of a man who managed chaos by eliminating it. Order, discipline, the careful control of every variable within his reach. These habits had served him well enough that most people read them as coldness and let the matter rest there. He had never explained the difference. There was no one in his life to whom the explanation would have meant anything useful. When Eleanor Bryce drowned in the Avon 18 months ago, the shape of Clara's absence returned so completely and so suddenly that he had not been able to breathe easily for a week. He told no one this. He began instead to make inquiries, quietly, through channels that cost him real money, because the alternative was to stand on another riverbank and know again that he had not moved. For 12 months, the inquiries returned nothing. Then a contact in Wiltshire sent a description. A woman matching certain particulars had been seen, some months after the drowning, in a small household in Warwickshire. He had kept the report and widened the search. And in September of this year, a second report arrived that he read 3 times. He had arranged the autumn gathering in Derbyshire. He had carried the violet because a woman in Wiltshire, helping to search the river in the days after the drowning, had found a waterlogged commonplace book on the bank a quarter-mile downstream, pressed open to a violet inside the back cover, and had forwarded it because she understood that the Duke was looking for the woman who had carried it. He had kept it the only way he could, which was close, which was carefully, which was without giving up. If you feel you already know what he is carrying toward, Leave a word below before we go on." The dowager had read the room on the first evening, when the Duke crossed from the door to the east window, without stopping to acknowledge the arrangement she had spent considerable effort composing. She read it again when a footman confirmed that the Duke and Mrs. Price's ward woman had been in the East Library together for the better part of an hour. She wrote to her contact in Bath that same evening. The reply arrived on the fourth morning. Lady Constance Ravensbourne was too accomplished a woman to do what she briefly felt like doing, which was to send the letter into the fire. She folded it instead with a very still hand, and thought clearly about what had to happen next. What had to happen next was that the ward woman had to go. At tea that afternoon, Lady Harriet said something to the woman beside her that carried across the room with the easy confidence of someone who has never had to calculate how far her voice travels. "That ward woman has been hovering all morning," she said pleasantly. "Does anyone know what she wants?" Her companion offered something indistinct. "Poor thing," said Harriet, with the generous pity available to women who are entirely secure in their own position. "Someone ought to show her where she belongs." Mrs. Price, who had been pouring tea at the sideboard, and who possessed 60 years of experience in knowing when a remark was intended to be heard, set down the pot without turning around. Eleanor, beside her, handed the next cup to the woman on her right, and said nothing. That evening, the dowager requested a private word with Mrs. Price in the small sitting room at the top of the stairs. Eleanor was not present. She heard the outcome in the quality of Mrs. Price's expression when the old woman returned, which was the particular expression of someone who has just been handed a problem they did not make, and must now deliver. "Ellen," said Mrs. Price carefully, "I am afraid there is some difficulty." Eleanor looked at her and waited. "She has said you falsified your references." Mrs. Price turned the small garnet ring on her right hand, slowly, the habit of a woman who thinks through her hands. "She cannot prove it, I believe. She does not need to. She only needs to say it to the right 3 people, and the county will do the rest." She paused, and her voice, when it came, was quiet and precise. "I would keep you if I could. I hope you know that." Eleanor looked at the window. The park outside was gray and still and beautiful in the way that October parks are when the leaves have almost finished. "I know," she said. "It is all right." She spent that night packing her small case. Her wardrobe required very little time. A second dress, a pair of wool stockings, a square of gray wool she used as an additional wrap against the cold, a nightgown that had been Mrs. Price's, and given without comment 6 months ago, when Eleanor's had developed a hole she could not mend invisibly. She folded these with the care she gave to everything, and placed them in the case, and sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, and looked at the room. A servant's room at the end of the east corridor. One north-facing window that caught no morning light. A fireplace that drew badly in high winds. She had slept well in it, because she was tired enough at the end of most days to sleep anywhere, and because she had made the particular peace available to a person who has decided they are not going to want anything they cannot carry. She opened the back cover of her commonplace book and looked at the violet. It had survived the Avon and a fisherman's cottage, and 18 months of being carried in a book inside a household that was not hers. The margins were water-stained, and one petal had developed a faint translucency it had not had before, but the color held, which was the main thing. She closed the cover and placed the book in the case on top of the folded wool and latched the clasp. At 5:30 in the morning, she stood in the entrance hall with her case and her coat, waiting for the side door to be unlatched. The house was not yet awake. A single lamp burned at the foot of the main stair. She heard, before she heard footsteps, the low voice of Mrs. Carew, a county neighbor descending early from her guest room, speaking to her maid in the corridor just beyond the hall. Lady Ravensbourne has told the housekeeper the ward woman is to be gone before the ball this evening, that her being here offends. A door closed. The words hung in the cold air of the entrance hall, and then did not. Eleanor picked up her case. She had both hands on the latch of the side door when she heard the main stair. A heavier, more deliberate step. Someone who knew exactly where they were going, and was not attempting to move quietly. The Duke came off the last step at a pace the hour did not justify, and the situation entirely explained. He took in the case. He took in her coat. He took in her face, which she had arranged into the careful neutrality she wore for things she had already decided about. He crossed the entrance hall in 3 strides and lifted the case from her hand and set it on the floor beside the hall table. She looked at him. He was dressed as though he had not been to bed. "You will not leave," he said. There was the long plain fact of her situation. There was the side door 3 feet from her hand and the road beyond it, and the particular freedom of having nothing, which was at least a freedom she understood. There was the very large and stone-gray weight of his regard, which she did not understand and had not permitted herself to try to understand, because the trying had seemed the most dangerous thing available to her. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, because she had made it so. "I have never been anyone here. It will be easier to not be someone elsewhere." She had meant it as a practical observation. From the quality of his silence, he had heard it as something else. He said her name quietly. Miss Bryce. Her name. Her right name. The name she had put away in the fisherman's cottage and had not heard from anyone's mouth since, because she had not permitted it, and the people who might have used it had believed her gone. He said it simply, without announcement, with the precision of a man using the correct word for a thing that has been misnamed long enough. The entrance hall was cold, and she could not move. He did not explain himself. He did not tell her what he knew, or how long he had known it. He held her gaze with the same careful, arrested attention he had given her in every room of this house, and she understood, standing in her coat with her case on the floor beside them, that the stillness she had read as indifference had been nothing of the kind. She was still standing in the entrance hall when the household began to wake around them. The autumn ball at Ravensbourne Hall was held that evening, as it had been held for 20 years, and the county had arranged itself accordingly. The musicians were in the corner gallery. The supper room would open at 10. The particular social geography of who stood where and with whom as familiar and as stable as the furniture. The Dowager stood at the top of the room with Lady Harriet at her side, and the full confidence of a woman who has decided that the evening's conclusion is already written. Eleanor had been placed near the east wall by a kind and vague footman who had simply put her where she would be useful and out of the way. She was in her better dress. She had done her hair with care. She wore the plain fichu that was her only ornament. She stood beside Mrs. Price, whose warm and steady presence required no words, and she watched the door. She had agreed to stay because the Duke had asked her to, and because she had made an agreement with herself in the entrance hall that morning that she did not fully understand the terms of yet. She was still working those out. The Duke entered the ballroom at 9 o'clock. He was announced. The room did what rooms did when he entered, a slight general reorientation, a small collective breath, the particular awareness that arrives when a man of his rank enters a space. The Dowager's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. Lady Harriet smiled with the composed warmth of a woman who has been preparing for this moment all season. He did not go to the top of the room. He crossed the ballroom floor in a direction that was not the Dowager and was not Lady Harriet. and was not any of the county families who had arranged their expectations across the evening. He crossed with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows where he is going, because he has been going there for a long time, and he stopped in front of Eleanor, who had not moved from the east wall. The music continued for one more bar. Then it did not. He took her hand. The silence that opened in the room was the particular silence of assembled people who are all breathing and none of them speaking. The held quality of a crowd that understands something is about to be overturned. The dowager's hand was very still on her champagne glass. Lady Harriet's gaze moved from Eleanor's face to the Duke's, and from the Duke's to their joined hands. He said, in the quiet and the held breath and the candle light, in the same level and declarative tone he used for things that were simply true and required no elaboration. "Miss Bryce, I have been looking for you." Her name, her right name, spoken in this room, in front of the county of Derbyshire and the Dowager and Lady Harriet, and every person who had called her the ward woman, or from nowhere or no one at all. Her name, and the plain fact of the last 18 months, set down in the public record of a ballroom with the irrevocability of something spoken in witness. She would count the words later. She could not count them now, because the floor was very solid beneath her feet, and she was grateful for it. And she was not going to weep, and she was keeping her face very still. Near the top of the room, the dowager's champagne glass was set down on the table beside her with a precision that communicated nothing except that Lady Constance Ravensbourne controlled where her glass went, even when the room was coming apart. Her posture did not fracture. She was too accomplished for that. The architecture of her certainty shifted in a way that was visible if you were watching closely, which Eleanor was. Lady Harriet looked at the Duke and Eleanor, and her expression, in the single short clause before she composed it, was not unkind. It was the expression of a woman who has been very certain for a very long time and has just understood, with some grace, that her certainty was based on incomplete information. She would find, Eleanor thought, that she had sufficient resources to withstand the evening. She was a woman of considerable composure. She would be all right. Mr. Sutton, the Duke's solicitor, who had arrived from London the previous afternoon, and who was not a man given to dramatic effect, came from the edge of the room and delivered, briefly and in the plain voice of someone stating established fact, his account of the relevant documents he had been reviewing in the estate library since his arrival. The claimant's position in the Wiltshire matter was invalid in law. The estate's surviving heir being alive and identifiable restored what her presumed death had placed in uncertainty. The necessary letters had been sent to the court in question that morning. Eleanor received this the way a person receives news they stopped hoping for. At a remove, the meaning assembling itself in stages, while the room continued around her, and the Duke's hand remained holding hers. Her father's small estate, Thomas's claim, which had never been sound. Her name in the court's record, attached again to a living woman. She had been restored. It was, in the end, as simple as that. The dowager withdrew from the ballroom within the quarter hour, Lady Harriet beside her, both of them moving with the dignity of women who are not going to allow the room to watch them go. The crowd released the breath it had been holding and reorganized itself. Mrs. Price appeared at Eleanor's other side, warm and steady, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The music resumed. In the weeks that followed, the formal arrangements were made with the care and the quiet procedural thoroughness that the Duke brought to all things he had decided, which meant that by the time the first snow settled across the South Park, the announcement had been confirmed and the dowager had departed for Bath, where she much preferred to spend the winter, and which had the additional advantage of being several hours' distance from events she had not managed to prevent. The library at Ravensbourne Hall was warm in the evenings. It had a fire maintained with the steady competence of a well-ordered household, 4 windows looking south over the park, and shelves that reached the ceiling on 2 walls and contained, among other things, a complete natural history in 12 volumes that Eleanor had begun working through on the afternoons when Mrs. Price napped and the house settled into its pleasant quiet. She had reached the 5th volume. She was looking forward to the chapter on migratory thrushes. She was reading one such evening, in the chair beside the east hearth, which had become her chair without anyone designating it as such, in the way that things sometimes become yours, simply by your being present in them consistently enough. The snow outside had been falling for an hour, lightly, without urgency. The Duke was at his desk, writing correspondence with the dutiful attention of a man who considers it an obligation owed rather than a pleasure taken. He set down his pen. He opened the drawer beside him. He held what he removed for a moment, without turning. Then he came to the chair beside her, his own chair, and sat down and opened his hand. In his palm was a pressed violet, water-stained at the margins. One edge slightly crumpled from being carried inside a coat across 2 winters. Its color held. Eleanor looked at it for a long time without speaking. She looked at him. She reached into the back cover of her commonplace book, which was on the table beside her, because she had been using it that afternoon to mark passages she wanted to return to, and she removed her own. She held them both, one from each hand, and then placed them together in her open palm, his and hers. Slightly mismatched in the degree of their water damage, because they had taken different routes from the same starting point. Perfectly matched in everything else, the same violet, from the same posy, from the same Tuesday afternoon when her father had come home with something ordinary and beautiful, and had not known it would be the last time. She had not known, until this moment, that there had been 2. She had not known he had the other. She understood now that he had carried it across 18 months of silence and searching and steady refusal to accept the verdict the world had rendered, through every room in which she had been no one in particular, and from nowhere worth naming, and that he had held it in the only way he could, which was close, which was carefully, which was without setting it down. The Duke's hand closed over hers, gently, enclosing both violets and both palms together, and the snow continued across the South Park in the unhurried way of snow that has all the time it needs, and the fire said what fires say when everything else has already been said. She had been drowned and erased and reduced and called nothing. She had held herself together with borrowed rooms and careful surfaces, and the plain stubbornness of a person who had decided, in a fisherman's cottage, to permit herself exactly one thing worth keeping. She had been looked for. She had been found. She was, at last, entirely where she was. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. If something in this room found its way to something real in you, leave a word in the comments, and the story will know you were here.